In March 1991, the existence of the area was suddenly under threat.
At the turn of the century, an entirely new high-speed railway, the Union Railway, will be brought into service. This new line will link the Channel Tunnel with central London.
The new station will be built just a few feet below the existing rail tracks. It will mean the demolition of 17 acres of land, including 84 homes, with a loss of just under 2,000 jobs from local businesses.
British Rail had plans to bring the Channel Tunnel to King's Cross. It involved grabbing land around the road and forcing out the people who lived there, just as when the station was first built. One of the streets under threat was a small crescent just off the bottom of the Caledonian Road. It was home to civil servant Randall Keynes.
The plan was to knock down the whole of this part of the crescent, because that was immediately over this huge underground station that they were planning to build. They would have been able to keep this side. It would have been on the edge of the hole, up to 40 or 50 feet deep, just there.
The whole work will centre around that site. So that will be the main work site for at least 6, 7, 8, and in reality probably 10 years. Now in that time, these people are expected to live on top of what is known as the biggest building site in Europe.
Well, how can I describe it? I mean, I was just completely devastated. You just felt that all the years that you spent getting the area nice, and then suddenly it was going. I mean, it was just such a devastating blow. The community hadn't been given a thought. Once again, King's Cross, there's no community. There's only drug addicts and prostitutes, which was, to me, was so untrue.
My first reaction was anger, not simply at their claim for our land, that they wanted to take it to knock it down, but because they had simply missed the point that we were there. They just had this idea that they didn't need to consider anyone living or working on premises in their way, because they were the rail company, and rail companies were allowed to rule.
The Caledonian Road found itself mixed up in a massive money-making scheme. In the property boom of the late 1980s, British Rail had joined together with private developers to build the Broadgate office complex over Liverpool Street Station. Now the rail company wanted to repeat that success on an even bigger scale by completely transforming 30 acres of prime London real estate around the Caledonian Road.
They didn't really think about how much our properties were worth to us. They were only aware that the property as a whole, if they could acquire it, would be worth so much more to them.
I mean, I remember at one meeting when British Rail were trying to sell us how good it would be, their legal man was sort of sitting at the table with this big grin on his face all the way through, and I freaked out, you know. I just stood up ranting, how can you grin? This is our lives you're talking about. Don't sit there grinning, you're laughing at us.
Some residents were determined to stay put, come what may. But others, uncertain about the area's future, began to sell up. The southern end of the road, always poor, hit rock bottom.
It has to be said that British Rail were talking about the neighbourhood as run down and needing to be redeveloped. And it was obviously in their interests to allow this whole atmosphere to get stronger and stronger. They had no interest in saving the neighbourhood from prostitution or drug dealing or winos collapsed on the pavement.
There was very little standing in the way of British Rail's plan to transform the area, except the determination of a small community not to abandon its home on the Caledonian Road.
We petitioned and we petitioned and we petitioned and we petitioned, and we put in hundreds of petitions.
Did you think you had any chance of pushing British Rail back?
Not really, not to start with. But that was the very first time I thought, well, this is it. You know, we're not going to be looked down on and treated like idiots. I mean, when you think we had to go to the House of Commons to petition, and I got cross-examined in the House of Commons. I mean, how intimidating was that for me?
The legal battle lasted over 5 years, long enough that the property boom turned to bust. Already on the back foot, thanks to the changed economic situation, British Rail was about to discover that the Caledonian Road had a secret weapon. Randall Keynes was the great-grandson of Charles Darwin and the grandson of economist John Maynard Keynes. And these illustrious family connections would be used by Randall to try to bring down the whole multi-million-pound scheme.
When it came to the debates in the House of Lords, I was able to approach two peers of the realm who would ask a question. And this was simply, could the Minister for Transport assure the House, that was the language, that the government will pay for this bill? And he knew and was able to tell the peer presenting the bill that the answer would have to be no. And at that point, the whole thing unravelled, and the government told British Rail that they must withdraw the bill.
British Rail's preferred option will not now go ahead. That news brought jubilation from the campaigners who tonight are claiming a famous victory over British Rail in defence of their homes.
I mean, it all sounds as though it was such a fight, but it was, I suppose. And it did take an awful lot of my time. But, you know, I just wanted a normal life.
I came to King's Cross from a life of privilege with a very good job and learnt one big lesson while I was here. And that is that my assumptions about how everyone in our country has their home, their livelihood well protected, that idea is just completely false. If you are poor and if you live in a place like this in the inner city, and it needed so much trickery and campaigning and fast thinking to persuade the government that British Rail's scheme was wrong and should be abandoned. And I think we should all be ashamed about that.
At last, the people of the Calais managed to defeat outside forces determined to use the road to their own ends. British Rail moved its grand scheme to nearby St Pancras station. The imminent arrival of hordes of European business people finally encouraged the police to clear out the drunks, drug addicts and prostitutes. The Lower Caledonian Road began to move distinctly upmarket.